Nof Clipper, hi friends, Darth Momo here, and today I wanted to do kind of a remembrance and an ode to Star Wars Rebels, which came out 10 years ago today. October 3rd, 2014. I remember that day watching the premiere up in my room. I didn't know what to think. These were going to be all new characters, an all new time period that wasn't really explored before on screen. This was the first kind of major Disney project to come out. So here we are 10 years later. There was a lot of people who didn't like the show when it first came out. There's a lot of people who probably still don't like the show. And there's some people that have, praised it in recent years or given it some more credit where credit was due, especially as it's become more prominent with the live action stuff, like in Ahsoka and The Mandalorian. So what do I think of the show 10 years later? How does it hold up? Is it good? Did it age well? And I think overall the answer is, yeah, it's good. It's aged pretty well. There is some stuff in the show that I criticized then, and I would still criticize now. I don't think it's a perfect show, and I think it absolutely has flaws and issues, or at least things I would have rather been done differently. But overall, I think, especially when you compare it to a lot of the newer Star Wars stuff that has come out, I think overall it's aged well. It tried to tell its own story with its own characters and some solidly written characters at that. There are so many iconic and great moments that have come out of this show, so many top tier Star Wars stories and moments and scenes. The music was phenomenal. I think probably its biggest criticism or weakness that you could probably still levy at the show is probably the animation style. I respect them for trying something different, especially trying to kind of do it as an ode to Ralph McQuarrie's art. It wasn't just doing something different for the sake of doing something different. Did it hold up well? I think the animation is probably, like I said, one of the weaker things, but I don't think it's the worst part of the show, or I don't think it's awful. I think the animation style was alright. Overall, I think the show serves as almost somewhat of a standard for how Star Wars television has tried to go forward, and has also set the bar for how a TV show should be done. And what I mean by that is a couple different things. So as far as setting the standard for some later stuff that has come forth, Star Wars Rebels it was different from Clone Wars, which is really the only major show that came out before. And Star Wars Rebels kind of set the mold of a smaller scale first season, kind of establishing the characters, the new worlds, etc., teasing some of the bits of the wider universe, and then once you hit into the second season, you kind of expand. And I think that's absolutely what happened with Star Wars Resistance, which was the first show to come out since Rebels. This also was very much the case with The Mandalorian, a more self-contained first season, wider Star Wars universe in the second and third seasons. The Bad Batch, kind of not. That's a little bit different because that was straight continuing from the Clone Wars as opposed to beginning its own story. I think the only other criticism I would probably levy at Rebels is the tone. I would have preferred a more mature tone, especially as time went on. I don't think it's as kiddie as some people say. I think it's nowhere near as kiddie as Star Wars Resistance ended up being. But I would have preferred a more mature tone in line with the Clone Wars. I understand why that didn't come to be, but that would have been my personal preference. Overall, I think there's so many things, though, that, like I said, that this show sets the bar for on Star Wars that a lot of shows have kind of failed to do. I think each season had clear, set out kind of goals or arcs or stories for the characters. Season 1 was very much about the relationship between Kanan and Ezra, as well as Ezra's kind of introduction to the world of Star Wars, the Rebels. There was also dealing with the Inquisitors, too. Season 2 had much more of an arc revolving around the dark side, Kanan's growth as a Jedi, as well as some of the stuff with Ahsoka and Vader. Season 3 was very much about the chess game between Thrawn and the Rebels. We kind of introduced that in the first episode, and we very much build up to that, to the Season 3 finale with that chess game between them playing out. And Season 4 is probably the best example of, we opened with the Mandalore stuff, get that out of the way real quick, wrap up that, and then we carry out the rest of the season with freeing Lothal and that arc. And Season 4 pretty much felt like a long movie. It was serialized, everything built on top of each other, and it brought us up to a payoff where everything became relevant. There was often a criticism that I think I myself probably threw a few times at Rebels of being filler sometimes, or having some filler episodes. And when you look at it, I think there's one episode, season 3 episode, I think this was episode 19. It was with Chopper and AP5 as like spies with Wedge Antilles. That one I think you can remove and not lose anything. But otherwise, everything else ended up becoming important by the end. And I think that's just a really well solid example of how to do a show. Everything was relevant, everything mattered, everything had a payoff. And by the time you get to the finale, it was that culmination of pulling together everyone you met throughout the show. It was very much the end of a journey. Everyone you met along the journey came in for the finale, and it was kind of all the characters coming together. Ezra calling in every favor to free his homeworld, which was pretty much something that he had expressed since day one of the show. And while Rebels has lots of smaller flaws or things that I would prefer done differently along the way, when you look at the grand scope of the show, I think it was just handled so well when you look at the wider story that the show tried to tell. And when you look at some of the arcs of where they start in the show and where they end up, I think, especially when you look at the arcs of Kanan and Ezra, there was very much a point A and a point B, and it got us as audience members from point A to point B. We got to watch these characters grow. I remember I have a friend who at first didn't really like Rebels, and he later rewatched it and he found a lot more to enjoy about it. And we were having communications about how you can really see the growth of some of the characters like Ezra. I know Ezra isn't a lot of people's favorites, and yeah, he's not one of my favorites either. But you can at least see some of the character growth put into him when you compare that to someone like Rey in the sequels, whose character growth was questionable at best. So yeah, overall, I think Rebels is solid, and I think it's brought us some of the best Star Wars characters and moments. There are so many great moments, from connecting to the wider lore with Obi-Wan and Maul, Ahsoka and Vader, the creation of the Rebel Alliance, down to the smaller moments that the show created. We have a lot of the character arcs and beats with Kanan. There's a lot of good stuff on Mandalore that it's built with its own original characters. The final highlights of Ezra and Thrawn. There's so much that was done well with this show and the wider universe, but also the characters it created. And, I thought it would be fun. I did kind of rankings of episodes as time went on throughout the show as it aired, but I thought it would be fun to kind of tie this video off with giving my top 5 episodes of the show. So I think it was hard to pick some of these, but I think if I had to go with it, my 5th most favorite episode of the show, and keep in mind there's 75 episodes, my 5th most favorite was probably Through Imperial Eyes. This was a different look at the Imperial side of things. We got to take it from their perspective as we followed Agent Kallus in his cat game with Thrawn. And as someone who was curious to see how Thrawn was going to be handled in this show, as well as someone who became a big fan of Kallus on his little redemption arc, I thought that was just a brilliant episode, and I really loved it. My 4th favorite is probably going to be Twilight of the Apprentice. I know that probably shocks some people, because Twilight of the Apprentice, some people consider as some of the best Star Wars out there. But Twilight of the Apprentice had a slower kind of start, and it wasn't as good of a payoff, I thought, to the season as a whole as maybe like the 3rd season's finale. But overall, there was a lot of great moments, and as a Star Wars fan, how do you not love so much of what we got in that episode? My 3rd most favorite is probably Zero Hour. I think Season 3 had a really good payoff of the chess game with Thrawn and the Rebels, and the 0 Hour finale just felt like a great payoff of all that. We had a payoff of Thrawn catching up to the Rebels and beating them. We had a payoff with Kallus's whole season arc when the Ghost grabs him in that little escape pod. That was just a satisfying payoff, such a satisfying payoff of a season's arc for this character. And such a devastating loss for the Rebels, and that you really feel hit home. Like, they don't really get losses like that we see in that finale. So it was just a great overall episode. My 2nd most favorite episode of the show would probably be Shroud of Darkness. That's the one where Kanan, Ezra, and Ahsoka go to the Lothal Temple. Probably the most mediocre part of the episode was just the opener, which was fine. Everything else was top tier. We get Anakin in the hologram form, from the holocron, sorry. We get Yoda talking to Ezra, and what a great kind of branch through of Yoda's arc from the prequels to the originals. It was cool to see Yoda again, of course. Everything with Ahsoka, with seeing Yoda again, to realizing Vader is Anakin, really well done. And everything with Kanan and that Grand Inquisitor as a temple guard, and when Kanan got knighted. Overall, the episode was just phenomenal. But I think the best episode of the show is Jedi Knight. This was from season 4. And I remember I had a conversation with an old friend of mine, Chris Yackerson, after the episode aired, and I told him it was my favorite one. And he's like, wasn't even that amazing of an episode, just the end. And that's right. Overall, for the first 15 minutes or so, it feels like just a regular Rebels episode. But what made it so special was that ending. This was the episode where Kanan dies, and it had to kind of make that a satisfying send-off for a major character. And knowing that as you watch it makes it hit home even more, that these are the final moments he's interacting with each of these characters. Each character got a final moment with Kanan. We focus on the relationship with Hera and Kanan, which was being very much built up throughout season 4. And then he dies. And it was just, it hit hard because of how well it was written and how well it was handled. I think he was the best character in the show. He's one of my favorite characters in the franchise. And I thought he got one of the best send-offs that a character in the franchise has received. And especially when you look at him getting his eyes back, paying off a promise that he would see Hera again before he went to Malachor and got blinded. Just the episode overall hit so hard. It was so well done. And looking at that, I think that's my favorite episode, because you have one of the top tier Star Wars moments where a top tier Star Wars character gets a top tier send off. And I think overall that's part of why I think the show has aged so well, and why this show is overall so good, and why it sticks out, especially compared to the Star Wars stuff we've gotten over the last 5 years or so. Not to say that everything's been bad, or that nothing or everything has no redeeming qualities, but Rebels it didn't try to build off of nostalgia like the sequel trilogy did. It didn't try to go too far out to where it didn't even really feel like Star Wars anymore. It didn't feel like it was just disrespecting you or anything. It felt like it was respecting and honoring the source material that came before, but at the same time, it was trying to tell something new. It was trying to go out there. Rebels didn't start off with pre-established characters. Yeah, there's some pre-established legacy characters that pop in now and then, but it didn't start by trying to build off of nostalgia or what came before. Rebels started by trying to build its own story, its own characters, its own locations and settings, its own world, and its own arc. And overall, while yes, it does branch out to the wider Star Wars universe and connect some dots, we harken back to some Clone Wars characters, we branch out to the wider universe of the films, but overall, Rebels never strayed away from its purpose. Rebels always stayed true to its characters. It always looked for ways to prioritize its characters over the characters from the Clone Wars and the movies, and it made sure to go out with a bang by telling its own story and wrapping up its own story. It didn't feel like it was just forgettable. Rebels has had so many moments and stories and characters and things that just sit with me and left an impact with me, to the point where I still think about that 6 years after the show's concluded. And this is after all the shows that have come out since on Disney Plus and the movies that have just felt forgettable to me. I don't think about The Rise of Skywalker. I don't think about The Acolyte. I don't think about Bad Batch Season 2. I don't think about Mandalorian Season 3. There's so much that has come out that has just been mid or forgettable or just But Rebels made sure to stay true to itself and focus on its own story that it set out to tell. And that's part of why I think Rebels is so great. I'll just kind of end this video. I'll wrap it up here now, I promise. But I'll just end it with what Rebels means to me. So often, Star Wars fans will talk about what their Star Wars was growing up. Very much the 80s and the 70s kids had the original trilogy. The 90s, 2000s kids had the prequels. I didn't really have... I watched Star Wars for the first time after the films were finished. So I didn't have the films as I was growing up. I didn't grow up as the films came out. Clone Wars, I got on the Star Wars train when the Clone Wars was about halfway through its airing. So, well, yes, I guess you could say Clone Wars was part of my Star Wars. I was at an age watching Clone Wars where I wasn't in the Star Wars for the deeper themes and the characters. I was in the Star Wars I was a 10-year-old kid. Star Wars was cool because of the flashy lightsaber fights and the action. It wasn't necessarily about the characters and the deeper meanings of the stories. Yeah, I guess you could say Force Awakens was my Star Wars, but the sequel trilogy wrapped up by the time I was a full-grown adult working a full-time job. So I wouldn't say that the sequels were my Star Wars, but Rebels was very much my Star Wars. Rebels came out when I was starting high school, and it finished when I was finishing high school. And for those who don't know me personally, high school is very much something I have a very probably unhealthy nostalgia for. I love that point of time in my life. It's an era I have a great respect for, a great love for, a great fondness for, a great nostalgia for, etc. And Rebels was just part of that overall experience that added to it. Rebels was something I got to see from when it was initially created and announced up to the point of its ending and its impact afterwards. I got to be there for every episode that came out, every Rebels Recon, the after show kind of behind the scenes thing that came out online after the episode came out. I got to see every single one of those, every weekly preview for the episode coming up, every trailer for the season. Rebels was my Star Wars. And as much as there is that I would criticize about the show, it very much has left such a legacy to the point where I almost want to say that's the Star Wars I have. I think Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars film out there. I think Clone Wars is the best show out there. But Rebels is what I have a special soft spot for in my heart. I mean, for those who followed my YouTube channel, like I said, my YouTube channel grew with Rebels. Rebels was what got me to some prominence on YouTube. I reviewed every episode as part of my growing with YouTube. I made a whole Lego miniseries out of stop motion, basically saying, what if I took the ideas of Rebels but put me and my friends from high school in it instead of the Rebels characters? Like, Rebels has had such an influence and prominence on me. And for that, I just want to say to Dave Filoni, all the creatives behind the scenes, the actors, the animators, the musicians, everyone who was a part of making Star Wars Rebels what it was, I just want to say thank you. Because I think 10 years later, Star Wars Rebels has been some of the best Star Wars to come out since the Disney acquisition. And if you took everything away, maybe leave Rogue One, but if you took everything but Rogue One and Rebels away, I could be okay with that, because Rebels is my Star Wars. Rebels is one of my favorite Star Wars experiences. I am so grateful for the show and everything it did and everything it brought to my life, as well as the stories it brought and the characters it brought. And to that, I just want to say to the Lucasfilm team behind Star Wars Rebels, thank you. And thank you guys for being here to celebrate 10 years of Star Wars Rebels. May the Force be with you. Always. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them in the light.